Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started, even though I think that we're going to have a few more people joining us. We are so pleased that you are here with us this morning. It's another gorgeous day outside. Don't know how many more of those we're going to get. So thank you for spending a couple of hours of your day with us. My name is Martha Page, and I am the Executive Director of Hartford Food System, and I am also on the steering committee for the Connecticut Food System Alliance. And welcome to the first of 4 sessions for this year's Connecticut Food System Alliance Summit. And I could not be more pleased and excited about the what's on tap for today. So the context for today's session is the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warning, their alarming code red for humanity that indicated that rising temperatures and increase in natural disasters have an impact everywhere on life, but they certainly do have an impact on agriculture and our food supply chain. We're already seeing the ways in which climate change impacts Connecticut, and during this session, local advocates will discuss their experiences with climate change and how the Connecticut Food System Alliance can integrate climate action into our food system planning. So our question for today is, how do we craft a food action plan that makes climate and climate change and its impacts a priority? You can go with the next slide. Oops. Oh. I think, did we skip a slide on the Connecticut Food System Alliance? Well, let me say a little bit about what the Connecticut Food System Alliance is. It is a statewide network of dedicated stakeholders committed to creating broad system change and advancing a just, equitable, sustainable food system in Connecticut. That is a mouthful, but fundamentally we are committed to food justice and a food system that works for everyone who lives in the state. Go ahead, you can change slides now. There's a definition of food justice. I'm sure that most people on this call are familiar with the term, but we believe that this is the underpinning of all of our work. Next slide. All right, and so our primary work right now as an alliance is to get some traction and to actually frame how our food system can fairly and justly work for all through the development of a food action plan. And a food action plan is a vision, it's a framework, it is a roadmap for action, and it will include lots of things. It will include data, it will include a vision of where we would like to see our food system going, and then recommendations of how we are going to get there. And just as a reminder, we are doing this work in Connecticut. We are doing it in partnership through project work across the region. And Connecticut is the only state in New England currently without a food action plan, and we want to remedy that. Next slide. All right, so we've already covered this. So I am going to switch gears here a little bit, and I'm going to introduce our moderator, who today we're very fortunate to have Chelsea Gazillo with us, and she is going to moderate the discussion with our panelists. She is American Farmland Trust New England Policy Manager and the Director of the Trust Working Lands Alliance in Connecticut. She oversees their policy efforts in New England, which includes directing research, education, policy development, and outreach. In order to do that well, she has to work with a lot of people, policy leaders, state government officials, community service providers, and organizations like the Connecticut Food System Alliance to advance policies that work to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and encouraging land access opportunities for farmers across the region. She's dedicated to advancing racial equity and agricultural conservation. But prior to joining AFT, we were very fortunate here in Connecticut to have Chelsea serving as a Food Policy AmeriCorps Vista member with the Bridgeport Food Policy Council and the Bridgeport Farmers Market Collaborative. So with With that, I will turn this over to Chelsea to introduce our speakers today. Thanks.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction. My name is Chelsea Gazillo, and I am the American Farmland Trust New England Policy Manager. I direct the Working Lands Alliance in Connecticut, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel on how climate change is impacting Connecticut's efforts to build a local food system. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to take a moment to reflect and recognize that the indigenous peoples who continue to occupy this land were and continue to be the first agricultural producers and stewards and steward the land that is now Connecticut. As such, as we discuss how farmers and landowners can implement climate smart or regenerative agricultural practices, let's keep in mind that many of the techniques we mention here today resemble agrarian traditions that have been practiced by indigenous communities across the globe since the inception of time, or for thousands of years. I'm honored to be moderating this panel with two climate change experts actively working to pass policies that will aid Connecticut in our efforts to mitigate, adapt, and become resilient in the face of climate change. I think, as everyone on this call knows, climate change is no longer a distant problem for farmers or for residents across the state. As we've seen in recent years, climate destabilization threatens lives, livelihoods, food security, and our economy across the state. Farmers have teetered on the edge of financial viability, and disruptions to the food system during the pandemic hit all farmers, but hit young, beginning Black farmers, Indigenous farmers, and other farmers of color especially hard. Recent changes in weather patterns and extreme weather events have caused uncertainty, and in some cases have destroyed a producer's season or even their entire operation. There is hope for farmers who are supported in adopting regenerative and climate smart ag practices, which will build a resilient food system as weather conditions continue to fluctuate. As you will learn from our panelists, the soil, our working lands, including our urban open spaces and the ecosystem services they provide, are an inseparable part of our local food system, ecology, watershed, and economy. From the speakers, you will learn about innovative production methods, investing in infrastructure, and strengthening supply chains, all of which are needed to promote climate resiliency. Can you go to the next slide, please? So without further ado, I am excited to introduce our two panelists. The first panelist is Kip Kolesinskas. Kip's major clients include American Farmland Trust, the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, Connecticut Farmland Trust, North Central Conservation Districts, and the University of Connecticut Extension. Much of his focus in his recent work has involved efforts to improve land access and affordability and provide technical services to new and beginning farmers. He serves on the Yukon Extension Solid Ground Farmer Training Cater, where Kip provides training and site assessment on land access, soil health, and climate change adaptation strategies. In addition, he works for AFT's national initiatives such as Farms Under Threat, Farmland for the Next Generation, and many climate change initiatives of the organization. Kip also assists the Connecticut Department of Agriculture with the Farmland Restoration Program to sustainably bring additional land back into production, and the Connecticut Farm Link Program, a farm access listing linking service. He is also one of the co-chairs of Working Lands Alliance and a member of the Connecticut Council on Environmental Quality. I am extremely honored to work with Kip day in and day out, and thrilled to be moderating a panel that he sits on. And our second panelist today will be Aziz Dehkan, who was born and raised in New York with a degree in biological sciences from Rutgers University. Aziz built an award-winning passive solar house and started one of the first organic farms in New Jersey. In management and development roles, Aziz has worked with social and environmental justice organizations, including the Coalition for the Homeless, Strive, the Fortune Society, and Mother Jones. As a community organizer and the director of the NYC Community Garden Coalition, in response to structural racism, he led the fight for land tenure and food security. Aziz served on the steering committee for the People's Climate Movement rallies in NYC, Washington, DC, and Sandy 5. Dreaming of a free Iran, Aziz is tirelessly searching for progressive solutions that support justice, equality, and liberation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kip Kolesinskas, who's going to get us started.
Myself unmuted. Hello, everybody. And I'm going to do a screen share, some screen share actions here. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm honored to be here with all of you trying to figure out some solutions. Let's see if we can get this to work. Here we are. Okay. So what I hope to, some of the topics that I plan on covering is just give an overview of global, regional, and Connecticut climate trends. And I'm going to go through that pretty quickly because I think a lot of you are familiar with that, and really spend a little more time on really understanding the impact. So thinking about if you're a farmer, a farm worker, or a critter or a plant, of some of the impacts and some of the stresses. And then we'll talk a little bit about some mitigation adaptation strategies. Considering the amount of time we have, I'm not going to be able to get into that in great detail. And though through UConn Extension Solid Ground Training Program, actually developing a online course module on climate change adaptation strategies. So hopefully when that's completed, you'll check it out. And then some challenges in addressing climate change in Connecticut. And of course, really excited about the planning for agriculture and food systems and the important work the CFSA is doing, and then actions we can all take. So again, as was pointed out, we're in a crisis, and that we know as carbon dioxide levels increase, temperature increases across the globe. Glaciers are melting, and fortunately, we're not. So our agriculture is not fed by glacial runoff as it is in many parts of the world. And we do have a food security challenge, which is a national security challenge and, of course, a moral challenge. And there's one of my heroes is Satish Kumar from Schumacher.
Kim, can I interrupt you for 2
Yes.
seconds? Yeah, if just a reminder to all of the attendees that if you are not speaking, please put yourself on mute.
Thank you, Martha.
Okay.
So one of my heroes is Satish Kumar from Schumacher College in the UK, who's a Jain monk, and he said that the impacts of climate change which the Jain monks are all about nonviolence in each and every form. And so he considers this violence against the earth. So that's, I think, something that's important to keep in mind if we want to practice nonviolence. So this is one of my favorite slides. I think it really summarizes a lot of these global challenges. And again, obviously, each and every one of us in Connecticut is part of the solution, but just looking at some of these, we know that yields are going to decline and the nutritional quality of yields is going to decline. Our fisheries are declining and being affected, and so many people, fisheries supply an important part of their protein. We know that things can get too hot for critters, for plants, for farmers, for farm workers. Water cycle is changing. We're going to need everyone to change behavior and major innovations in how we eat and how we farm. So again, a lot of this will be things that many of you are already familiar with, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. We know that precipitation patterns are changing. We have increased rainfall, and particularly in the Northeast. You can see the changes on the bottom there. Seasonal precipitation, greatest increases are in the fall in many years. Plant hardiness zones are shifting, and they've already updated and changed the plant hardiness zone in Connecticut, and it's going to continue to change. Seasons are shifting. Higher temperatures can mean longer growing seasons. You can see some of these predicted changes. And that's one of those things that, you know, when I started working on this years ago, and the modelers were developing these models of what the changes are that we might expect in climate and weather patterns, that it's amazing how accurate they have been, that basically everything that they said was going to happen has happened, and though it's happened faster, and in some cases much more severe than what was predicted. Seasonal temperatures are rising. Think about the number of the last couple of years, the number of days over 90 degrees that we've had continuously. Temperature rises. And then, of course, it looks like they're finally going to, this is the latest. Every week I look at the USDA NRCS publishes a publication about basically the state of the snowpack, of precipitation, soil moisture, and it gives a 3-month prediction as relates to temperature and precipitation. So I check that out every week. And so this was the one that was published this week. And even though, of course, they're expected to get some snowfall and rainfall on the West Coast, that obviously that's going to help, but it's not going to take them out of this, what's considered a mega drought. And you could say the same thing from the Pacific Northwest and California, all the way down through Mexico and South America, where agriculture is basically has a Mediterranean climate and or is fed by snow melt. And as glaciers are melting, that becomes more and more of an issue. So, and again, as we think about it, not just here in the US or in Connecticut, but globally, of people that are displaced, you know, we saw that with storms of folks from Puerto Rico coming to this country. We have climate refugees at our borders. The failure of the coffee crop in the mountains of Central America is pushing people for migration. So climate's on the move. So this is just a summary: more frequent days and temperatures that are hot, short periods of drought, longer growing season, increased heavy precip, overall precip more, earlier snow melt, warmer winters, fewer chilling days, less frozen ground and snow cover, periods of sustained high winds, tornadoes. And this is probably the most difficult one for farmers to overcome, is less predictable weather. Your first and last frost date, when the rain is going to come, dry periods. That's what's basically, having predictability is what's allowed us to be successful as a species within agriculture over the last 10, 12,000 years. So, and though, compared to other parts of the country, other parts of the world, we're actually going to have more water than we need sometimes, less at others. But basically, we're going to have adequate water, longer and warmer growing season. There's going to be shifts in productivity elsewhere, so there's potential to expand and diversify. And that from a food system standpoint, we have, the Northeast has about 24% of the United States population on 7% of the land. So we can make a difference within a relatively small part of the US, can create jobs, economic growth, and we can also do this while protecting ecosystem services. So now let's get into the details of what's going to cause changes and difficulties for agriculture in Connecticut in the Northeast. So increased heat stress. So it can get too hot even for tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, and that dairy animals do not do well when it gets hot. Milk production suffers and they don't eat as much. We're seeing increased weed and disease pressure. And of course, what it's also allowing is in some cases where new insect and disease pests that you didn't used to be here are here now, and invasives that have shown up from other parts of the world because of globalization are able to get a foothold here. And the additional CO2 in the atmosphere, invasives really love it. Anything that's vining that really loves it. And you see the bittersweet and the grapevines killing trees. And of course, which is always helpful, poison ivy has gotten more poisonous. Too much water, we all saw that this year. Chelsea talked about the impacts that we saw to agriculture in Connecticut of too much water, flooding, ponding, saturated soils. So it's not just crop loss, immediate crop loss, you also get more diseases. You end up affecting soil health by getting compaction, trying to get into those fields. Short-term summer drought risk. So right now we're saying anybody that's starting a fruit or vegetable operation, you need to make sure that you have a reliable water source. You might not need it every year, but you need it because we're going to have these short-term intense droughts. It may only last a month or 2 months, but if it's at a critical part of the growing season, you're in trouble. Opportunities. So there obviously, we would prefer that there is not this overwhelming climate change. And though for our part of the country, there will be opportunities. You know, a couple of those hot years that we had here, I think we had some of the best fruit, melons, peaches that we've ever had in Connecticut. Some of the best wines produced in red wine grapes produced in Connecticut. Longer growing seasons, probably not the bananas, but definitely melons, tomatoes, peppers, new varieties. There are already people that are double cropping. That's 2 crops per season. There are people that are doing, and I think there's more opportunities for even triple cropping. So, and then how does this really affect the crops? So we're talking about lowering yields and reduced fertilization. So we might not be able to have our beloved Macintosh apples because it doesn't get cold enough. New pests and diseases I talked about. Some things are going to do better, some worse. And then from a soil health perspective, soils can get too hot and they can be too cool, they can be too wet. So those are all considerations that the agricultural producers have to consider. Okay, and then this is something that the modelers did not talk about, but I think we've all experienced of these periods of sustained high winds. When I came to Connecticut in '83, you would never have 24, 48 hours of 50-mile-an-hour winds. And now we're experiencing that because of these changes in the jet stream of the contrast between cold and hot, and then also more tornadoes too. So we've seen a lot of damage to agricultural structures. And then we can't forget about the importance of Long Island Sound and our estuaries. So because of our hardened shoreline and built up shoreline, we don't have some place for migration of salt marshes and for eelgrass, and there's changes to flora and fauna in our estuary, in our oceans, changes to aquaculture, and then the acidification and warmer water are challenges for our growing shellfish industry here. So to me, as I said, the most difficult part is probably the uncertainty of not knowing, is this just bad weather or is it climate change? Do I make these investments? How do I pay for them? Am I going to be able to recoup that in the marketplace? How do I overcome these limitations? So I'm going to stop there to make sure that Aziz has time, and all is not lost. We have our challenges, and though in the next segment later, I will talk about adaptation and mitigation strategies. Thank you. So I'll stop my share here.
Thank you, Kip. Aziz, are you ready to take it over?
It'd be very helpful if I unmuted myself.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Aziz Dehkan. I am the Executive Director of the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs. I've been asked to talk about this because I have a background in land tenure as a former director of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, where I've been made very aware of the climate crisis and how it affects land. When Sandy hit New York City at high tide, areas that were flooded took hours and hours and hours, days actually, to recede. And one of the things that we noticed was that the areas around the community gardens, the buildings that were adjacent to community gardens, had less damage than just about anywhere else, especially on the Lower East Side. And one of the things that's kind of remarkable about that is that these areas are sponges. They absorb so much water. And one of the things I want to talk about in this next few minutes is, what are we doing with land? I mean, how do we treat properties? How do we treat virgin forests? How do we place Amazon warehouses? How do we place even like solar siting? How do we do that? How do we do that in a way that's ecologically sound, that works in a way that, especially, excuse me, especially with solar panels? I mean, they take a broad amount of acreage to do this. And what we need to figure out is, where do we place these things? Trees are carbon mitigators. And if we're going to try to resolve climate crisis, and you'll have to excuse me, this is allergy season for me, so excuse me if my voice goes crackly on you. If we're gonna find ways to solve the climate crisis, we have to find ways to preserve open space. We have to find ways to make sure that not every tree is cut. I live in Clinton, Connecticut. On my street, which is aptly named Cow Hill Road, my neighbors seem to be on a tree cutting spree, apparently for no reason at all. Maybe they're following Eversource's plan of just like every tree near every pole has to be cut. This is wrong. This is really wrong. We need to find a better way to do this. Maybe, you know, we need to put money into infrastructure so that the lines that are outside my house are underground, so we don't cut trees down. I mean, these seem to be very simple solutions. Recently, I was talking with a group, and they were asking me about entitlements. You know, what about entitlements to people? And I have to stop for a second there. And we get so upset about entitlements to people, people in need, but we don't have any problem subsidizing Eversource. We don't have any problem subsidizing the dying fossil fuel industry. So where do we go from here? I have to take a step back for a second. Where do we go from here? I think what we need to do is come up with a comprehensive plan. And we try to do that. You know, again, the question about entitlements came when I was up at UConn a couple of days ago. I did a lecture series there. And the questions that they asked were, how is the federal government going to help me? And frankly, folks, I don't think it's going to help you at all. If you're going to rely on Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema, you're not going to get any help. The help has to come from this group, and the help has to come from organizing from this group up. You know, Joe Paul O'Neill. I was going to say Paul O'Neill. He's a Yankee. Sorry, Red Sox fans. But Congressman O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. What I learned in New York City was actually all politics is street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. And that's how we organize. That's how we really make effective climate change. And how does that affect the food system? Well, it affects the food system in multiple ways, the way Kip was describing, right? You know, I went to my local supermarket yesterday, which is also a huge carbon footprint, by the way. And I was looking for berries. Berries are completely out of season here right now. What do I find? Berries from Peru. Let that sink in for a minute. What's the cost of bringing in blueberries from Peru that actually probably aren't really good anyway, that don't taste all that great? So we need to find a different method. And there are multiple ways to do this. We know multiple ways. Kip knows multiple ways. Chelsea, you know multiple ways. All of you have seen change. So what I always preach, and if my staff is on the call, hold your ears, because you hear this all the time from me. I don't want new normal. Why would anybody accept new normal when normal hasn't been working? I mean, we're on Zoom today because normal did not work. So we need to figure out a different way to do this. We need to grab a narrative that works. We need to make sure that lands aren't taken through a bureaucratic process that's basically a rubber stamp. We need to be diligent in watching our bureaucrats. We need to be diligent in how we place things. And don't get me wrong, I know the value. I work for the Roundtable on Climate and Jobs. I know the value of making sure that we build out a green infrastructure. Do we need to put it on farmland? And the question then goes further than that. Are we building on farmland because farmers no longer have a sustainable living? And if they don't have a sustainable living, then the question, and maybe Kip is better equipped to answer this, or one of you on this panel, in this group would better explain this to all of us, is what does that sustainable model look like? And how do we make sure that that we can grow bananas in Connecticut? No, we can't do that. But how do we make sure that we have enough food to be able to feed ourselves, and to make sure that the transportation system for that food isn't a large carbon footprint? You know, one of the biggest problems we face in Connecticut is transportation. You know, Route 95 is 4 miles away from me. You can hear the trucks downshifting often from here. There's also an Amtrak rail line next to us. Why isn't that Amtrak rail line used to better efficiency to transport food, to transport people? We need to be creative, folks, and we can do this. We know how to do this, but we don't have necessarily the political will to do it. So that's where I'll leave it, and hope that one of or all of you can help answer that question.
Thank you, Aziz. And that's a really good segue into the next part of this discussion. So many of us on this call were a part of Governor Lamont's Council on Climate Change, or also known as the GC3. And I'm going to give a quick shout out to Kaylee Roston, who she works for the Department of Agriculture and led the efforts for the GC3's Ag and Soils group to write a final report that outlines how our agricultural sector and the soils that make up our working land can be a critical part to the state's efforts to mitigate, adapt, and become resilient in the face of climate change. And so I've been asked to ask Aziz and Kip, because both of you were also a part of the GC3 efforts, to discuss your participation in the efforts, and then to elaborate on any of the recommendations that came out of that process that you think are exceptionally critical and that we should be acting on sooner rather than later. And then I will also say, are there efforts that may not be in the near future for us to act on, but that you know are critical, and that we really need to be not forgetting that they need to happen ASAP? Because as we've been talking, climate change is, it's not the new normal. We need to figure out how to combat it now. So yeah, I'll just turn it back over to both of you. I don't know, Kip, maybe you want to go first?
Sure, and I do have a few additional slides as relates to the GC3, but again, as relates to some of the things that Aziz said, I think part of it and I had worked back under the Malloy administration on the 2010-2011 plan, which also I think is worth people looking at. There's some really good information in there as well. And though one of the big disappointments is that there was so little that was accomplished from all that great work then. And as Aziz said, you know, there was not the political will. And yes, there'll be additional pandemics, and there'll be additional famines. And until right? We come to terms with climate change and realize that a food system of consolidation and fossil fuel-based transportation and people not feeding their own communities is a failed model, then we're all going to struggle. And though we know that we can do better, and one of those things too is that it's a wicked, what's called a wicked problem, and I don't mean as in your brother-in-law from Boston talking about wicked. I'm talking about, you know, complex for needs changes in behavior, is a result of mass political policy failure, and is very, very complex. So we're talking about a wicked problem here, people. So let's view it that way. And the GC3, I think there's some really good stuff in there. To me, the premise was, because it was based on reducing emissions rather than what we really needed to be was to address climate change in all of its impacts for everyone, that the perspective is very, very energy and emissions related. So if you have that perspective, you end up with, as Aziz pointed out, you can end up with such a focus on renewable energies and renewable energy production rather than conservation and looking at all the sources of emissions and understanding the potential impacts to human and natural systems. And I would say the greatest disappointment is not more respect and recognition of the importance of green infrastructure and protecting and enhancing what we do have already. Because farmland and forest land, as Aziz pointed out, and we have, you know, some soils that are great at infiltrating water if we give them the chance. We don't pave over the whole friggin' state. So let's appreciate, let's create incentives in the marketplace, whether it's, you know, paying what food really costs and helping others afford it that can't, building a state and regional food system, and providing payments for ecosystem services. So I think those are some of the things that, if you really look at the details of what's in each one of the subcommittees' reports, not just the phase one, which has some good stuff in there, and I'll highlight a few of those good things that Kaylee and the group put together for the deep report. But go back and look at the subcommittee reports. There's some really good, important information that I think can really help us have a more holistic systems approach to this problem. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I was working, I came on late to GC3. The former executive director of the Roundtable, John Humphreys, was deeply involved in it. In fact, was one of the founding members of GC3 and putting that together. And so my role was towards the end of looking at transportation. And I've already brought that up. I mean, we need to look at a different transportation system too. If we want to get into the weeds on this, you know, why aren't we further along on e-vehicles, for instance? And why aren't we further along on charging stations? Again, I like to bring up personal anecdotes, right? So I have a friend who came to visit us from New Jersey. It's the first time we had people in our house in like 20 years, it felt like. And he has an electric car. But he was worried about driving from New Jersey to Connecticut because he didn't know how many charging stations there were along the way. I'm looking at my calendar, it's 2021. Where are we with that, right? And the GC3 is making an extremely good attempt at looking at transportation. There's a number in the transportation section that continually astounds me. And I think the number is close to 28% of people in Connecticut do not have cars. I'll let that sink in for a minute, because I would imagine that most of us on this call do have cars, and most of us probably don't have to take public transportation to get from, let's say, Bridgeport to New London to get to go to work. And do you have to get up at, if your job starts at 8 o'clock, do you have to get up at 4 in the morning to take 3 buses to get to New London? I mean, what is that? And maybe Bridgeport, New London is not the right way to look at it. It's people who live outside those cities as well. How do you rectify the transportation system in Connecticut to make it accessible to people who don't have vehicles, and to make it a positive impact, if there is one, on the environment? Again, Route 95. It's not an expressway anymore, it's a slow way, and we just sit in our cars for hours often spewing more carbon. I mean, there are better answers, and I don't think there's better answers using electric buses. We're working on a carbon-free, a healthy school program that we hope to launch in Bridgeport soon. And what astounds me is that we're transporting children in diesel buses to schools that are powered by diesel fuel. Again, I like to let that sink in. Yeah, when I was a kid, grew up in New York City. My public school bus was a diesel bus. I remember smelling it. So, 70 years later, or whatever that is, we're still using the same transportation modes. There's a lack of effort here, not a lack of ability, but a lack of effort. Again, take the money that you're giving to the fossil fuel industry and put it towards clean buses, put it towards clean cars, put it towards more charging stations. I'm almost afraid to use the 3 letters TCI because it's such a hot topic, but we should look at TCI. We should look at the possibility of making TCI an equitable, transformative way to look at transportation and climate. But is there the political will to do that? I'll leave that to all of you to figure out. But it surprises me that we're not even further along, that we haven't passed TCI and joined other states in making a better way to transport people and food and food, because that's why we're here, right? We want to talk about that. So, Kip.
I guess the one other thing, those are all excellent points that I would offer, is that in that ag and soils, there is, if you go back to the actual subgroup report, there is a very good section there on food systems that Chelsea and Meg and others had put together. So I think there's some really good ideas there that hopefully the folks working on the food system plan will mine some of that information and take a look at that. And then the other thing that I think is that there's a really good equity section there, an inclusion section. And so I think that's there's some messaging in there as relates to outreach and implementation that are important to pay attention to. So I'd recommend people take a look at that.
Thank you, Kip. And I am reminded that I was reminded that there are some slides that we can share about the current GC3 process and what the next steps in the process look like. And I think, Kip, you were going to present out on those slides. So can we share the slides? And Kip, do you want to take it away?
Sure. I don't have those other slides in my slide deck, but if there's, I know that I have some that relate to more of our subgroup, but if these, right. So, I guess these are coming up.
This is just an overview of what the
Right.
Governor's Council on Climate Change is, the history of it. And I have a slide coming up about its most recent meeting and how it was revived in the past few years. So you don't have to worry about presenting on this. This information is just available to everybody. I'll share these slides post-event. I don't know if you have more to add.
Yeah, well, other than Commissioner Dykes did do a presentation on basically the results of the phase 1 report and what actions have been taken. So it's not that there haven't been any actions that have been taken, there have. And then of course there's, you know, the phase 2 piece that is is to be worked on now. And so, you know, I think that it's really important that your state legislators and your local elected officials are aware of that document, are aware of some of the recommendations.
After the efforts of John Williams to defend their property failed in the face of overwhelming force, and then literally all of them fled their lives.
Ken, if you're not, can you put yourself on mute?
For having to live with the knowledge that a mobile home was dragged across that field, an outrage they did not witness.
Okay. Thanks. So, and all of the slides from Commissioner Dyke's recent forum on, you know, what's been implemented and next steps are all available on the Deep Energy site. So I'd recommend people take a look at that. But I did pull out in a separate slide in the next slide deck that I'm going to use of some of the specific recommendations that we had in the natural lands and the ag and soils group that I can cover.
Okay, great. It looks like that is the next thing on the agenda for the policy recommendations for next legislative session to be discussed. So Kip, take it away.
All right. Let me get down here to this next section here. Okay, so I wanted to get into just a little bit more, and then this will lead into the deep phase 1 report and some of those recommendations. So I just wanted to give people a little more. So as you're thinking about how farmers are going to mitigate emissions and adapt to climate change, so that here's a field that did not have an irrigation system during the 2016 drought, and so ended up basically having one harvest and then a crop failure. So again, some of these things that relate to agriculture and food systems, so think about that, is the opportunity for changing our diets of eating less meat, because as we know, there are sources of emissions from agriculture and impacts from agriculture. So doing things differently, we have the ability to mitigate emissions as well. So eating less meat, more grass-fed meat reduces emissions. Opportunities on not only for manure, but also for food waste, for biodigesters, which also can be our source of renewable energy, that we know by building soil health, and that soils, well-managed agricultural soils, so using cover crops, doing less tillage practices, other things, we can store a lot of carbon in the soil. By changing our forest management, we can store additional carbon, we can create a renewable energy source. By using less fossil fuel-based fertilizers and pesticides and more organic methods, that we can reduce emissions. And then again, which is the heart of this presentation, the reason for it is by changing our food systems. And Aziz talked a little bit about transportation. So we know hauling stuff from across other parts of the world here of dubious quality based on fossil fuels. It also creates a lot of food waste, which cause emissions. And that, again, an average farm in Connecticut, only about 60 to 75% of it is actually used for production. So the rest of it is wetlands, forest, other kinds of habitat. So it's providing a lot of ecosystem services. And so species need a chance to be able to migrate to other parts of the landscape. So when we have fragmentation and we have loss of farmland, those species don't have that ability to move. We can continue to reduce our water use and through management, technical assistance, and that again, those farms are really important. And as Aziz mentioned, I think there's a huge potential in urban suburban areas to have agriculture, get water into the ground to recharge aquifers, protect our floodplains, and manage our stormwater. And then, I could go on and on about solar arrays, but though there are opportunities when it's done the right way, where large scale arrays can actually have a co-use with certain forms of agriculture, if agriculture is the primary purpose, and also solar arrays as part of an active farming operation to help them use less fossil fuels to keep their business economically viable. So we could do a whole presentation on that. And then here's really more of the on-farm. These are some of the practices that we're working every day with farm businesses on, of things that they can do or need to be thinking about. What I like to say is to the farmers that I'm working with is that each and every decision that you make, you need to have climate change and the impacts of climate change in the back of your mind. I don't care whether it's, obviously if it's something that's costing money and it's expensive, it's even more critical, but every decision from your seed choices to how you're laying out your fields to the equipment that you purchase, you need to have climate change in your mind at all times. So we're going to protect and diversify soil resources. Unfortunately, the last storm event, we had farmers that had all of their fall crops on the floodplain. In some of their cases, that's the only land that they use and farm. So you've got to diversify where you're growing certain crops. Focus on soil health, getting the carbon into the ground. When you have wet soils, managing in a way you're not causing compaction. Plan for the emergencies, those tornadoes and those wind events. Do you have a generator? Do you have access to a generator, a chainsaw? So you're going to manage your risk. You're going to manage your water resources. You're going to utilize integrated crop management systems. So what does that mean? So that might mean, you're going to do soil testing. So when we get a rainfall event, how many nutrients you have, what might be lost, to split applications, to use integrated pest management. So you're using less pesticides and fertilizers. You're going to diversify your enterprise and the farmers. So again, as Chelsea mentioned, that we have access to farmers, recent immigrants, that maybe their voices haven't been heard, that really have a lot to teach us. Folks from other parts of the world, other parts of the country have techniques, have crops, have livestock that are better adapted to heat or to changing weather patterns. And then diversifying the farm enterprise. So is that the income source? Is that the varieties or the breeds that you raise and grow? Reduce stress from extreme temperatures. I know people might not look like the way that they look, but indoor agriculture. So whether that's high tunnels or greenhouses, because you have more control and you're less subject to the extremes. Engage in farm planning and adaptive management. So again, farmers are really good at adaptive management, but you need to have a whole farm plan that includes climate change. Manage those soil and water resources. Engage stakeholders. So we need to do more listening of what folks need, help find those solutions together, and develop and use decision support tools. And we need increased research and demonstration sites. So here's an example of some of the newly adopted systems of using high tunnels and hoop houses where you're actually growing in the ground, but it's covered in plastic. Greenhouses, mulches, and row covers. Mulches are really important for moderating soil temperature, preventing erosion from those extreme events. We talked about different crops and breeds, low investment crops. So that before we're only growing tomatoes and there's there's blight or wind damage, you're not going to lose the whole crop. Doing more rotations, wet and drought resistant crops, double and triple cropping, silvopasture, using grazing underneath trees and other food crops, forest farming, and reducing the amount of tillage. So those are some things. And there's some great tools out there. We need more tools. We need more research. There's some good stuff that's being done at USDA, some good stuff that's being done at Cornell for calculating your growing degree days, your freeze risk, irrigation scheduler, soil moisture sensing. So I could go on, but I'll stop there unless you, Chelsea, you want me to continue on to the last few slides, which has the GC3 piece. Looking at the agenda here.
I'm going to turn it over to Aziz, and then I would like to open it up for broader engagement from the group and start to actually dive into policy recommendations, because there are so many great advocates on this call. Like I see Jeff Cole from the Carrot Project and Kimberly Acosta from the city of New Haven and Jeff Martin. So I think it would be great if we could hear from some of the other folks for a minute that are working on resilient food system policies from the local level to the state level, and start to configure how we work together to advance some of them. So, but before we do that, Aziz, do you want to maybe respond?
Just quickly, I come out of Rutgers University, which has a really good extension service, and I've had a farm, and with the utmost respect to all the research, I think the real research for farmers and for finding better ways is with farmers themselves. And I think it actually goes down to how do we look at agriculture in this country as well? Listen, I had a small organic farm, and I was able to produce quite a bit of food off that farm, enough to sell and sometimes even to give away to food banks. So we have to look at a smaller model. This country loves big warehouses, big malls, big roads. I think we need to reduce. Small farms, minority-owned farms are really vital to the work that we need to get done. I have a friend who's with the Black Urban Gardeners, and her farm in Orange, New York, her name is Karen Washington, actually one of the heavy hitters of community gardens in New York City. And Karen's work in Orange, New York, take a look at her site. I mean, it's woman-owned, a minority woman-owned. These women are fierce farmers. I mean, that's the only way to say it. And what they know how to do, and what small farmers know how to do best, is to deal with climate. Many years ago, I worked with the Connecticut Farmland Trust for a short period of time. And I remember talking to farmers who would talk about climate, and they would say, oh, weather is cyclical. Weather is cyclical, so we have to learn how to deal with that. And so, well, part of that might be right. I think it used to be weather was cyclical. Now it's just a cyclone-able, or whatever you want to say. We look at 100-year storms as if they're yesterday, or it's coming tomorrow. They're called 100-year storms because they only come very infrequently. So I think farmers have a real good feel, no matter how you say it, if it's cyclical or if it's a climate crisis, they know how to do this because their livelihood depends on it. And again, I'll just turn it back to this. We have to look at different models, and they're out there. People are doing these different models. Kip showed that slide. There's so much information there, and it's useful, but it's on the ground. It's like organizing, right? I was just saying you have to go block by block. You have to go farm by farm, maybe, if you want to really make an impact here. So, look, I don't have slides, and I'm not a policy person, and I'll give all the credit to Allison Pilcher, who's our policy director of the Roundtable. Direct your questions to her. She'll be able to better answer. I'm just a loud voice in the world trying to find ways to change things. And but I know they're out there because I've seen them. I've been a part of them. So I'll be quiet. I want everybody to, I'd love to make sure that everybody has a voice here because you all have answers. And again, together with answers, that's how we move things forward. That's how we go from new normal to change.
Great. Thank you, Aziz. Yeah, that's a nice segue into opening it up to some of the policy advocates and others on this call that might have comments or questions for our speakers, or if you have other things that you're working on that you would like to add to the conversation, they're very much welcome.
And I will remind people, you can take yourself off mute or raise your hand or however you, or put your question in the chat, however, whatever works for you. But it would be great to hear from you and to allow our speakers to respond.
Yeah, well, a question based on everything was talked about, it's kind of coming in my head, like I'm thinking, you know, how do we reduce importation of foods and, you know, save on carbon emissions in that way? And, you know, of course, community gardens are an answer, but like I'm thinking of all the people who make up a lot of the big cities in Connecticut are Black and brown, indigenous people, people of different cultures, right? And they eat all kinds of different foods that are especially grown in South America and or the Caribbean or something, and then they're imported. So I'm just like, my question is there a technology or a way with a greenhouse that can grow some of these foods that we're importing from these hot climates, like plantains and such? I don't know if there's a way or technology in agriculture that can grow foods like that in Connecticut. And also, if we can't do it, why aren't we partnering with territories like Puerto Rico, which are a US territory that has a hot climate, and we can like have an agricultural boom over there too and help, you know, so it's kind of like a two-part question, but.
So Angel,
yeah, so it's
this
just
is
for
Aziz.
anybody.
I'd like to tackle that for a minute. You know, in New York City and some other urban cities is a little redundant, in other large cities, the move is towards urban agriculture in warehouses. It's actually Elon Musk's brother is heavily involved in these projects. And while that seems to be a good idea, I'm not sure what the carbon footprint on that, how that helps reduce anything. There's a lot of electricity for lights. There's a lot of water usage. It's an answer, but I don't think it's the answer. I don't know. I think, you know, part of what you're saying, you know, of looking at, for instance, Puerto Rico as a food source, that makes some sense, but I think we have to just change our eating patterns, perhaps, you know, like it's winter, we don't eat berries. It's winter, we maybe bananas aren't available, or zucchini. We have to find we have to find different ways to eat. Maybe it's plant-based food as well. I don't want to promote any brands, but I've been eating plant-based burgers for years now, and they're getting better and better. And you know, if I just saw this horrific video of what they do to cows. You know, maybe we have to move away from all of that, because that's a huge source of pollution and air quality issues. So, you know, I think part of what you're saying is right. We have the capabilities. Maybe I think, you know, it just occurred to me. So in the Musk model of indoor growing, they're using electricity. Maybe you throw solar panels on top of those buildings to be able to make that happen. On the farm that I had a passive solar house, and had I had the resources, we would have built a passive solar greenhouse that would absorb a lot of heat, and that's an answer also, that you could go through the seasons. You know, massive, large-scale passive solar greenhouses. Now I'm thinking that's great. You could go just about anything through the winter. So there are answers, but I don't know all of them, clearly. Did I answer everything that you asked, Angel?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if anybody else wants to offer something, but just a couple of thoughts. One, of course, is that, I believe across the planet that, first of all, people should be feeding themselves in their communities, and there shouldn't be as much effort on export as part of the economics of a country. They should be feeding communities first. And though in this country we have not good job of really, and there's really no plan for how do we protect those unique areas, such as the Connecticut Valley, which has a longer growing season, warmer growing season than any place else in the state. Or Florida, for instance, you talk about sprawl and of course impacts of climate change, but Florida and the coastal areas of Louisiana and Mississippi are some of our few really subtropical agricultural regions, and we've done a very poor job of protecting those from sprawl. And of course, again, it was mentioned, Puerto Rico also has a subtropical environment. So I think that there are opportunities from a systems approach. And then as far as I would agree that greenhouses, even that with LED lights and solar panels, and they are very efficient at water usage, they do have a role, but obviously they're not going to be able to feed everybody. So we need to think about them in the right way. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Kip. And I will just add really quickly that as somebody that works very closely with a lot of dairy farmers and some of the meat producers in the state, I don't think that we don't have large scale dairy farms and beef farms like other parts of the country. And I do think that most of the dairy farmers in the state want to do well by the land and do good by the land and implement better practices so that they can be a part of the climate solution. And I think we really need to honor that and to hold on to that and to figure out how we can support dairy farmers in transitioning to climate smart agricultural practices. And I'm not sure that the solution is for everybody to go to a plant-based diet. And also I think if we want to look at this through a food justice lens, we really need to think about not policing people's food choices just because that's going to save the planet. We got to figure out how we can make sure that everybody can afford to eat good local foods. And so I just feel like that there are a lot of systems we need to go after changing to make this happen. And yeah, I will leave it there. It looks like Angel has a question again.
Well, but before we get to Angel's question, I do want to pile on to that a little bit with another notion, is that we don't have to do this by ourselves. I mean, and we don't have to think, well, let's just, what can we do and what do we need to do just in Connecticut? That we need to think regionally, we need to think across state lines about what is possible for us to do in order to think more holistically about our food shed here. And that some of that work is underway, but boy, there's a whole lot more of it that needs to be done. So, and yeah, Angel, you had another question.
Sorry, it wasn't it's just a follow-up. I'm glad that Chelsea, you said that, because I'm just thinking of my community, and my community, we be very plant-based diets could be in our diet, but it's not going to replace a lot of meat in our diet. It's like culturally, like meat is like, it's hard to get away from it. And meat is something that we usually don't talk about when we talk about these things. And like if everything, you know, these animals could live happy lives and be grass fed, and then that could be the meat we eat, then that could be a solution to the problem. But to get away from meat, I don't think you're going to win that debate. You know what I mean? And you know, the only thing about Puerto Rico that I mentioned is that, you know, Puerto Rico is very economically unstable, and it's like, you know, we're trying to bring industry to the island, and there's a lot of people working on agriculture on the island already. And so that's an up and coming thing. People are getting interested in how to grow food. So yes, they want to feed themselves, but they would love an opportunity on how to make money for the island if it becomes a booming industry. And like to import stuff from South America, where, you know, we have less economic interest than in Puerto Rico. It's like, why aren't we paying Puerto Rico to grow food to feed themselves and the world and the cultural people in the United States, in the inland United States? So that was my only point with that. But, you know, the warehouse thing, it would be great idea if sustainable energy was used and sustainable water practices. So yes, this would be a sustainable way. That'd be kind of a good way. So I'm not going to comment anymore, but thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Angel. And I think we have time for maybe one more comment, and then we have to move on to the next part of our agenda.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Cole. I'll take the opportunity, more of a question than a comment, and that relates to, given that we have 24% of the population and 7.5% of the land mass, you know, what can we rely on for, you know, secure food supply that's produced locally? I think we can do a much better job than we currently do, obviously, but it'd be good to get some as hard data as we can to make some predictive models on what seems to be realistic, and that will help us, I think, with future planning and obviously with policy. And the last thing I'm going to say is, as a note in terms of farm, smaller farm sustainability, the National Farm Viability Conference actually has a session on the 26th at 1:15 p.m. It's a report on PASA's study that's looking to understand how much, how profitable smaller scale farmers could be. So that might be something that people want to pay attention to. There may be some information to glean there.
Thank you for that comment, Jeff. And I also just want to mention that in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is starting a process to write a farmland action plan for the state. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to maybe just talk briefly about that, because I think your comment / question about how much land mass we have in the region and how many people we have to feed is super prevalent. And I do think that we need to do some good regional and statewide planning to figure out how we are going to make more of our land available for agricultural production and to keep it in agricultural production.
Sure, I'll make a comment, and it's the summation is, it's going to be my frustration with the state's planning efforts around climate change and their continued siloing in their thought process. We've heard from Kip and others that, you know, the holistic approach is going to be what's required. It's great that we have the planning process to create a farmland action plan going on. Concurrently with it is the, you know, greenhouse gas, you know, or whatever, the emission limits planning. I happen to be involved in that as well. And currently the state is focused on forests and carbon sequestration in forests, and not, doesn't appear to be looking at farmland in and of itself. And it's on a, you know, it's on a massive binge for electrification of the power system in Massachusetts, which we're pretty sure is going to put a lot of pressure on farmland under the current policies. And so the plan should help, as long as the powers that be pay attention to it in addition to the climate work. And I'm not clear that they will at this point.
All right, thank you for that, Jeff. So moving on to the next part of our agenda, we wanted to ask the speakers 2 questions and give them time to answer them. So the first question is to both of you, strategies for addressing climate change in Connecticut. So this is something that you both have experience in, and we've talked about being able to shift from individual actions to collective actions. So what would this focus on? Local foods, changing farming practices, and some of you have, or both of you have already mentioned this in some ways, or paying for ecosystem services on farms. So what are the strategies that you both have identified in your work and you think we should be prioritizing?
You want me to go first, Kip? I'll go first. Kip's muted. I'll go first. The Roundtable has been working with the trades in Connecticut and unions in Connecticut to build out, to move away from fossil fuel-based energy consumption to a green infrastructure. We do that through working with the trades. We passed a bill, SB 999, which puts project labor agreements into large private and public renewable projects like solar, and we look forward to continuing that trend to see how much more we can build out on green infrastructure. I just saw an article recently about how, if you look at a map of the United States, where there's gaps in between where renewable energy is being produced, and the gaps are not where you think they necessarily would be, and we need to find a better way to transmit the energy that we're developing in renewable energy. So that's a piece of it. And then again, we have to be careful of where we site these things, right? To make sure that they're not on farmland, that they're not cutting down trees. I know I'm repeating myself, but maybe it bears be repeating that, siting is a huge issue here. And part of this, of what I said earlier about, getting the trades involved in this, is because they're concerned about jobs. I mean, we're talking about food, but food and jobs and sustainability all are an intersectional piece of the work that we're trying to do here. So we want to make sure that as we do a just transition from fossil fuel to green energy, to renewable energy, that we bring in the same workforce that's been working in the fossil fuel industry into the new energy sources that we're doing. And again, going back to food, because this is a food forum, we also need to make sure that that we recognize what farmers need as well. And again, it's intersectional, right? Because you can have all the great jobs you want. If you're going to have to pay 5 times the amount of food for berries that are coming from Peru, that's not going to help you any. So we need to find a equity in everything that we do. And again, the Roundtable tries as much as we can, but we're not always successful at this, to view the world, at least view Connecticut through the lens of equity.
Thank you, Aziz. Kip?
Sure. I want us to share these last couple of slides, and I'll talk from them. So let me get to these last couple of ones here. I think in that, again, as was mentioned, of really understanding the threats, because the threat to agriculture and food systems is not just as relates to climate change. So as we know, sprawl is back on the rise right now because of where we're geographically located. We're in the food shed of New York City, Boston, Providence, and we're also a hotbed because of the road and rail networks for distribution centers and server farms, which take a huge amount of, right now, we're losing a lot of farmland to those as well. And again, as was mentioned, because of the rush towards renewables without understanding the unintended consequences of the impact of losing within agricultural communities hundreds of acres of our best land, which is most resilient to the effects of climate change, to large-scale solar arrays. So we need to have better siting criteria, and DEEP is supposed to be working on a stakeholder process so that we can look at the criteria that's being used for defining which projects get funded or not funded, so that agriculture and food systems and farmland get more consideration. We have high land prices, lack of affordable housing. We have an aging landowner farm population that doesn't have succession plans. We have a lack of access for beginning farmers, for farmers that want to expand, for urban farmers. We know that there are tools such as farmland preservation and community land trusts and better planning and zoning. We know that there are tools that can address these things. Again, there was comments made as relates to, you know, if we do want to eat more seasonally and locally, we have a lack of aggregators, of food hubs, of processing, of storage. We know those are things that we need and that we can take care of. We have, you know, I'm going to use a dad comment here. The municipalities are the tail that wags the dog for land use policy in the state. So unless we do something about the 169 municipalities, most of which do not recognize or support agriculture and food systems in their planning and their land use decisions. The rules and regulations need to be changed. We can do that. We have lack of adequate state level planning, incentives, and disincentives to support farm and food systems. Again, from a grassroots perspective, we need to be talking with our elected officials. We need more statewide planning, and we have consumers that are either unaware, unsupportive, or lack access to support local food production. So we know with some messaging and outreach and some of these other things that we can make a difference with that. So again, just to emphasize, sprawl is still a real and emerging threat. American Farmland Trust updated this national study completed in 2020 of farms under threat, looking at this threat across the country. And again, looking, as Martha said, got to look beyond our boundaries. Look as a region. You know, there's a really good study, which I guess Chelsea said they're updating, of the New England food vision. If we wanted to grow and raise 50% of our food, what would that look like? Could we do it? And we can. So, and this is not a list. You want to be one of the top 12 of states that are most threatened by sprawl development. So Connecticut's number 7. We know farmland preservation works. We know that buy, protect, sell, getting land in farmers' hands works. We know community land trusts work for land access, long-term leases. So again, the GC3, we talked about that. There's some really good information on working in natural lands. Some of the recommendations that are in there, which are things that are all doable to some degree, is again, reducing conversion of our best farmland and forest land. We can do some on-farm energy production, reduce use. We can strengthen our land use planning. We can improve soil health. We can prepare farms for climate change, build sustainable, equitable food system on a state and regional level. We need research that's, you know, based on on-farm trials and experiences, and focus groups with farmers. We need to address coastal acidification. That's a harder one. So again, we've got to, at the municipal level, and we all live in a municipality, look at those policies and regulations. Do they support farm and food systems? That's a change we can make. With Chelsea's efforts and Lethaw and other folks, we updated these 2 planning guides, planning for agriculture. And we really tried to bring in information and tools and techniques to bring equity and to bring climate change into the municipalities, should they choose to use that information. And for landowners, what other options to protect their land, to get it in the hands of the next generation. So those are tools that we can use. The sustainable CT a really good effort. I think that it, unfortunately, this is where municipalities can evaluate how effective they are at being sustainable. Do they have the right rules and regulations? What are they doing? I think it needs more teeth. It needs more input as relates to agriculture and food systems. And again, it needs carrots and sticks to get municipalities to make these changes. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kip. On that note, I actually want to, before we move on to the next question, I actually want to ask Martha to maybe just speak briefly about the New England Feeding New England regional partnership that CFSA is a part of, because I think it's prevalent to a lot of things that Kip just mentioned.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that question, Chelsea. Yeah, Connecticut Food System Alliance is the Connecticut representative to a regional project called New England Feeding New England. And it's being supported by some regional philanthropy and by the USDA planning grant for regional food system projects. And it's in the second year of the 2-year planning grant. And the goal of the project is to figure out what would need to be done at the regional level for us to achieve a 30 by 30. So 30% of the food consumed in New England produced in New England, and that includes our fisheries and all of that. So it doesn't have to just be growing, but 30% by the year 2030. And we are doing this very much in connection with the other regional work, the Food Solutions New England, the original 50 by 60 concept that was just mentioned. But the work that is underway now is to, as part of the planning grant, is to understand where we are. What data do we have? What data do we need? The project has commissioned a significant number of regional researchers to actually help us answer that question. And the goal is, and understanding that this is a multi-year project, the goal is twofold. One is to answer the question, what would each state in the region need to do in order to contribute to that goal? And the second part of that is that how do we then work as a region to actually make that come true? So this is, it's great work, has the opportunity to bring a whole lot of processes together, including contiguous plans like the Governor's Council on Climate Change, those recommendations. These are not, we're not considering these things as separate, that we're looking at plans that have an impact on the food system and how do we incorporate that all into our thinking.
Thank you, Martha. And I will just add, as somebody that sat on the Ag and Soils working group that was part of the GC3 process, and as Working Lands Alliance has the opportunity to engage with our USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service state conservationist Tom Moger on a regular basis. I do think that the state in the nearest future needs to configure a statewide climate and ag program for farmers that will pay farmers something to help incentivize farmers to implement a lot of the practices that Kip mentioned. And so I know that is something that some of us on this call are working on, and we're also looking at potentially configuring how we can update the Farmland Restoration Grant Program to be able to support farmers in implementing some of these practices. So, and that was a recommendation that came out of the GC3. I know there are other New England states that have similar programs that help farmers and support farmers in paying for things that some of the USDA programs won't cover. And I just think it's critical as we look towards creating a resilient food system that we have to to look at every aspect of the food system and how we can support every aspect in moving towards becoming more resilient. So the next question that I've been asked to ask the speakers is, again, you both have so much to contribute in this category of challenges in addressing climate change in Connecticut. We've talked about some of them. Affordability for farmers, bringing more people into the movement, being able to create change in a small state. How do you make climate change something that every person cares about? And what is our messaging to make climate change something that every person has time to care about? Also, Connecticut is a home rule state. There's 169 towns and zoning can be difficult. Kip brought up sustainable CT. So could each of you talk more about this and maybe discuss in more detail some of the tension between farmland and siting for solar, affordable housing, and the development of farmland? I know, Kip, you brought up farms under threat and outlined how you're losing a lot of farmland to development, but maybe you want to talk more about how can we make it so that we don't lose as much farmland to development, what is needed to do that. So I guess I will turn it back over to both of you. I don't know which one of you wants to go first in answering this question.
Sure, I'll go first this time. Yeah, first of all, just to build on what you'd said is that, again, some of these, the techniques that we had talked about for farmers to use for mitigation and adaptation, they're expensive and there's risk associated with it. And typically there is no way for them to recover those costs in the product that they're selling in the marketplace. So since it's to all of our benefit that they're successful and can do these practices, that's certainly, I think, an important consideration. Is so whether it's paying for ecosystem services or providing some dollars to help afford some of these practices and techniques, I think that's something that we can do at a federal and a state level. And then as far as, again, the whole big picture of a systems approach is that the reality is that there's not enough resources on this planet for if everyone, the big myth is, oh, we want everybody on the planet to live the way that we do. And there are not enough resources on this planet right now for everybody to live like we live or think that we live. So we got to get over that. And that there are many of the things that we would do to mitigate and adapt to climate change are the things that we should be doing anyways for sustainability to be able to stay on the planet, regardless of whether or not you think it's human-induced climate change or if there is climate change. We should be doing them anyway. So as far as Aziz talking about transportation systems, we need to pay what the real cost. We have this cheap food policy in this country, so we subsidize some aspects, such as what it costs for fossil fuels to transport food across the country or to fly it in from other countries, and with environmental damage that's associated with clearing rainforest or emissions or whatever. So we really need to look with a systems approach to everything. But as far as, and with Martha's comment on the regional approach and a state approach, is that farmland preservation and farmers and farm workers making a living wage are really important parts of that. So we know the techniques for farmland preservation so that there can be created a permanent easement on a property that stays with it, but people can still farm using techniques that are going to protect the soil resource. We know that those are techniques that work, and those systems have been around since the 70s, and new emerging techniques such as ground leases for farmland and community land trusts, and really long-term leases or other techniques that can be used, and of helping people think about, which of course succession planning is really hard to get people think about their eventual demise, but you could create incentives. A lot of these things, people respond, got to find what's going to motivate people. So is it a tax incentive that if they, sell a conservation easement or create access for a new and beginning farmer, that they're going to get a tax incentive to do that, or to change their conservation practices, to get an ecosystem payment. So I think, since we're in a capitalist economy, and that we're, a teenage culture where everyone doesn't want to make any sacrifices or giving anything up, heaven forbid, how do we create incentives and disincentives that are going to motivate people to take actions in the right direction? And then I'm hoping in some cases, you can, by providing the relevant facts, if we have key messages for the different demographics as relates to things that they consider to be important, will that motivate them to make different choices with incentives and disincentives? So I think, we really need to work on our messaging and have the leadership and communities to help bring these messages forward, and to offer people, an alternative to, as Aziz said, going back to normal. Well, as I would agree, I don't want to go back to normal, because it's the wrong, at this point in time, not that it was ever the right direction exactly, but we know that it can't be the direction to go back to. So again, there are a lot of tools and techniques that we know of. Agriculture, it's, as a soil scientist, it's all about the soil, protecting the soil resource, and that of, basically, to use a vulgarity, pissing away our best prime and important farmland because we don't want to pay a little bit more to put a friggin' solar array on a rooftop is just ridiculous. So we can make better choices, and our land use planning and where we live and where we work needs to be more thoughtful. We need to have more mass transit options. We need to be able to get people to the station by walking or biking. So there are so many pieces that we need to do work on, but the solutions are out there. And if any of you have ever traveled to Europe, they're well ahead of we are. And of course, that's part of our culture too. We couldn't possibly learn anything from anybody else in another country. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Kip. Aziz, do you want to take a few minutes to answer the question?
A very few minutes, because there's, Kip's right. There's so many models that we could learn from. In Slovakia, I just read there's a city in Slovakia that's all bike. So, smaller cities can go towards that. Change takes time, and change takes a different mindset. One of the things that I think we need to do also is just, I want to go back to something Angel said, because he's right. I was trying to promote plant-based food, and even my own culture, Iranian culture, we're meat-based. So we have to find a different way to produce the foods that people actually want to eat. But before I finish this, my section here, there are a couple of models on with solar panels that deserve to be talked about. The first is beekeeping on large solar arrays. If you plant in between rows of panels, if you plant wildflowers, apparently you can produce some really amazing honey. And it's not a pipe dream. It's been done in the Midwest. I think there's one in Idaho that's been happening. One of the I states it's been happening. And the other one is you can bring in sheep to keep the grasses down across solar arrays. And that's yet another way to combine, to intersect between a green infrastructure and agriculture. So yeah, you might have to give up some open agricultural land, but you can make some productive use of that land if you're trying to be innovative and just get out of your mindset that nothing can be done because everything can be done. Oh, and by the way, thank you, Kip, for following my lead on No New Normal. Appreciate that.
Thank you for that, Aziz. So I think for the next 15 minutes that we have with one another, we wanted to open it up and have a broader discussion. And I just want to bring up something that was mentioned, but I do think is worth having further conversation about, is that climate change is dramatically impacting our state's BIPOC communities. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, there is a long history of land theft and land dispossession and policies and provisions that have kept and stolen land from BIPOC in the state of Connecticut. And I do think as we look towards developing these new programs and policies, that we really have to do it with an equity lens and an environmental justice lens. And the Connecticut Department of Agriculture is spearheading an initiative that's their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission, and there are many subcommittees that are a part of that. And I know that that group hopes to create recommendations that the state can implement to make more of the Connecticut Department of Agriculture's programs accessible to BIPOC, and to hopefully pass policies that will create more affordable land tenure opportunities for the state's BIPOC. And also we are lucky to have Kimberly Acosta on the call. I know that she's working very tirelessly in New Haven with WFA and others to develop an urban agricultural master plan for the city that will outline how some of we'll do a whole zoning overhaul and outline how some of the municipal lands and other lands in the city can be made available for urban farming and community gardening. And so I just think that it is such an important part of this work, and I don't want it not to go undiscussed. So with that being said, yeah, does anyone have any comments or questions about what you heard today with the last 13 minutes that we have?
I have a question going back to one of our discussion points.
Sure.
So there was briefly mentioned, how do we get people to care? Obviously, climate change is impacting every part of our lives, whether we can fully recognize it or not. But when it comes to going to the supermarket and seeing those berries imported from Peru, how do we get someone to care that those berries are out of season and not from either Connecticut or the Northeast? And how do we get them to act on advocating for that change?
Oof, that's a tough one. Because everybody wants berries.
Yeah, well, again, I think that you've got to change in some ways, yes, there are culturally significant foods and we need to recognize that. And though that when people talk about frustration of that, I don't know as an individual how I can make a difference in climate change, that is a difference you can make by your food choices. So when you're going to a restaurant, when you're working or interacting with an institution, you know, again, you need to ask for and demand that, you know, where did this, which I do, which of course my partner's not always happy about, of where did this come from? You know, you're saying that these are local cheeses. Are they really local cheeses? You know, why are you serving berries from Peru when there are local berries that are available? So part of it is asking for Connecticut grown and locally or regionally grown and produced stuff to make some of those changes, and and to be clear, as I said, some messaging about what are some of the impacts of food choices. And again, where there, and not all local and regional stuff is going to cost more, or when it's grown and raised in a way that people can make a living wage, but let's create the mechanisms so that that's not a barrier.
Yeah, and I think change takes a little bit of time too, right? I knew somebody years ago, way before we started recognizing the rising asthma rates in marginalized communities. And his response to the climate crisis was, we have to stop talking about the white bears in the polar caps because they're cute and they're endangered and they're in trouble. But we need to address the asthma rates in the cities, and we need to address the costs of that and the echoing costs of why that is happening. And that's the echoing cost is clearly climate crisis, right? So yeah, I'm not backing off no new normal, but I'm just saying that change is difficult. Again, I want to go back to what Angel Serrano said. You know, there's a lot of cultural influences that we have to address and that we cannot ignore, because if we ignore them, all we're doing is repeating the same structural racism that we've created in this country. So again, we have to be really careful at how we move forward, but we have to be bold about it as well.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions or comments for the speakers?
This is Jeff Cole again. I have a question. How bold do you think we can get with carbon pricing?
As bold as we dare, as bold as we're politically able to do. We clearly don't have enough time. I have some questions about carbon pricing and how that works and the equity of carbon pricing. But it's as bold as we're able to be, I suppose. But if it's not in an equitable, if it's not done equitably through an equitable lens, through a lens of being able to make sure that, again, people in marginalized communities reap some benefits from it, I'm not so sure it's that viable or that it can be that productive. It's tricky.
I did want to point out a question in the chat. This is for Kip from Angel, and also I saw another hand up. I think Nicholas, you had your hand up, but we'll do the question from the chat. Is nutrient depleted soil common or a problem in Connecticut? If all soil was healthy in Connecticut, would it help with carbon sequestration, or is that a myth?
Right. Well, as we know, there are a lot of myths out there, and though no, it definitely would help. In fact, there's been some research done. A coworker of Chelsea's, Emily Cole, who actually lives in Connecticut, did some calculations, and if we were to use the right kind, some of the soil health practices as relates to cover crops, so having the soil covered and doing less tillage and using more legumes in our cover crops and more nutrient testing and different kinds of fertilizers and rotations and things like that, that we can sequester a huge amount of carbon, and it's the equivalent of taking, I think, Chelsea, what was over 100,000, hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. So it's definitely significant. So one advantage that we have here is because we're still a relatively cool, humid climate, that is easier to sequester and store carbon in the soil. As far as carbon, as far as nutrients, the challenge with the increased precipitation, higher groundwater levels, and more intense events, meaning more rain, with our sandy soils, is that the nutrients tend to leach. So if you had just applied fertilizer and you get, 4 inches of rain from an event now, which is not unknown, you basically have lost a lot of your nitrogen and your potassium, and you're going to have to reapply. So by doing soil testing, doing split applications, relying more on stored nutrients with organic matter, you can reduce the leaching. So yes, we have to manage our nutrients differently, some different techniques, and yes, we can store a lot of carbon in our soils.
So Nicholas, you had your hand up, and I wanted, maybe we should make this the last question since we're coming up close to end, so we can just have a couple of seconds of wrap up. So Nicholas, did you still have a question?
Yes, I think it was 3 questions prior, maybe the first question we had. Are there any available sort of, I think in grocery stores, it would be super helpful to have environmental impacts on imported fruits and vegetables versus local in-season vegetables, so it's staring people in the face. Does anyone know of any organizations that perhaps would already be aggregating that data, or do you think that would be a possibility in order to sort of make that information readily available when people are actually making their purchasing decisions?
So who wants to tackle that one?
Well, the only thing that I would say is I know that it's been that at least the origin of where your fruits and vegetables is better known than meat. It's been very difficult for them to get the right kind of meat labeling. And I know that that's something that Congress continues to struggle with, because there is meat that's coming from elsewhere, but because then it gets portioned up here that it may have a US label on it when it's really not US meat, I believe. It's not really my field of expertise, but obviously we now have, there are labels as relates to wood products and labels as relates to seafood. It certainly seems like that could be something that could be developed and could be valuable in the marketplaces, so people are making more informed choices.
I have 3 words to answer that and to respond to what Kip says. Beware of greenwashing.
Oh, Martha, you're on.
Well,
mute.
on that happy note, I really want to, we're just about out of time here, and I just really wanted to express our appreciation to Kip, Aziz, and Chelsea for kind of like sharing their thoughts and their questions and the kind of like the thoughtful recommendations that give us a whole lot to think about. I want to thank everybody who has attended as well. Thank you for being here and for attending the first of our 4 sessions. And in that regard, kind of like we have several sessions coming up, and if you have not signed up for these other sessions, we highly encourage you to do so. The next one coming up is going to be next Thursday, and we are going to actually be hearing from both Massachusetts and Maine, the folks who are responsible for the implementation of those statewide food plans, and what their experience has been and things for us to think about. So a chance to build on what we heard today and think about very much like, how do we move forward in putting a plan together? So the other thing that I will wrap up with is that, we would love to hear from you. And there are the connection points here, the members of the steering committee. But if you have anything about this session, about state food planning, about anything that's on your mind regarding the food system here in the state, please feel free to reach out to us. And you'll see the email there, communicatefoodsystemalliance.com. And that goes right to Marcella, who I also would like to thank for everything that she did to help pull this together. So on that note, I will say have a great rest of the day and a great weekend, and we will be in touch soon.